The text came through while I was rehearsing Rachmaninoff in my apartment, my fingers working through the cascading arpeggios of the third concerto, and at first I barely glanced at my phone when it lit up on the music stand. Got $500 for that old piano taking up space in the living room. Guy came and picked it up this morning. Finally have room for the grandkids' toy chest when David and Sarah visit. Talk soon. Mom. I stopped playing mid-phrase, my hands freezing above the keys of my rented Yamaha, reading the words again because surely I had misunderstood. That old piano, the Steinway Grand. My grandmother's 1923 Model M that had sat in my parents' living room in Columbus, Ohio for the past 12 years, because I couldn't afford to ship it to New York when I first moved here, when I was 20, and surviving on ramen and audition fees, and the thin hope that I could make it as a professional musician. They sold it. For $500. I felt the air leave my lungs in a way that reminded me of the first time I performed solo at Carnegie Hall 3 years ago, except this was the opposite of that breathless exhilaration. This was devastation, pure and cold. That piano was worth over $50,000, maybe more given its condition and provenance, but the money wasn't what made my hands shake as I set down my phone. It was the casual cruelty of the message, the breezy disposal of the instrument my grandmother had left specifically to me in her will when I was 12 years old, the piano where I'd learned every major piece in my repertoire, where her hands had guided mine through my first scales, where she'd told me I had something special, something worth nurturing. My parents had promised to keep it safe. I'm 32 now, a principal pianist with the New York Philharmonic, and I make $240,000 a year before performance fees and recording contracts. But my parents still talk about my career the way someone might describe a niece's scrapbooking hobby. Interesting. Harmless. Not quite real. My brother David, 3 years older, is a real estate developer in Cincinnati, moderately successful, and they speak about him with a reverence usually reserved for surgeons or astronauts. Never mind that I've performed for ambassadors and been reviewed in the New York Times and toured Europe twice in the past 18 months. When I was 7, practicing Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat major on that Steinway, my mother had walked through the living room and sighed, saying, "That's nice, honey, but remember it's just a hobby." And I should have known then that nothing would ever change, that no amount of achievement would shift their perception of me from the daughter who played piano to someone whose career mattered. I tried calling immediately, my hands still trembling, but it went to voicemail. I stood in my Manhattan apartment, surrounded by the evidence of my success. The framed placard from my Lincoln Center debut, the 3 albums on the shelf, the closet full of concert gowns, and felt 12 years old again, invisible in my own family, the girl whose recitals were inconvenient and whose dreams were too loud. Before continuing the story, please subscribe. I need to reach 1,000 subscribers to be able to bring you stories like this every day. For you, it's just a click, but for me, it means a lot. The pattern started when I was 13, though if I'm honest, it probably began earlier and I just didn't have the language to name it yet. My music teacher at school, Mrs. Chen, pulled my parents aside after a recital where I'd performed Beethoven's Pathetique Sonata and told them I had genuine talent, the kind that deserved serious cultivation, and she recommended the Juilliard pre-college program in New York. It was a Saturday program for young musicians, rigorous and prestigious, and it cost $8,400 per year, plus travel expenses from Columbus. I remember sitting in the car on the drive home, my hands still tingling from the performance, hearing my father say, "That's a lot of money for a hobby," and my mother agreeing that music was wonderful, but they needed to be practical about my future. I didn't say anything because I was 13 and didn't know how to argue with their certainty, but something inside me understood that this was a rejection, not just of the program, but of who I was. David was 15 then, and that same year they hired a private tennis coach for him at $120 per hour, 3 times per week, because he'd made the varsity team and my father thought athletic achievement would look good on college applications. They hired an SAT tutor for him the following year at $150 per session, twice weekly for 6 months, and paid $3,000 for a college application consultant to help him craft his essays and select schools that would showcase his potential. I kept playing, kept practicing on Grandma's Steinway after school, but when I asked if I could take lessons from a more advanced teacher in Columbus, someone who specialized in classical performance technique, my mother said we couldn't afford it and suggested I appreciate what I already had. I was 15 when they told me that if I wanted to continue private lessons, I'd need to contribute, so I got a job hostessing at an Italian restaurant near our house, working Friday and Saturday nights for $8.50 an hour, plus a cut of the tips, and I paid Mrs. Chen $40 per week out of my own pocket for lessons she gave me at a discount, because she believed in me even if my parents didn't. My practice sessions at home were frequently interrupted by complaints that the music was too loud, that my mother had a headache, that my father was trying to watch television. Never mind that David's music was always blasting from his room at volumes that shook the walls. My recitals were scheduled around David's tennis matches, and I remember with perfect clarity the day I won the regional young musicians competition, the biggest achievement of my 16-year-old life, performing Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 2 with the youth orchestra, and my parents weren't there because David had a tennis tournament 3 hours away that same afternoon. They'd asked me to reschedule my competition. When I explained you couldn't reschedule a competition, my mother had sighed and said, "Well, David's match is important for his athletic scholarship chances." And they'd left at dawn with thermoses of coffee and matching visors, and I'd accepted my first place medal with Mrs. Chen cheering in the audience, and an emptiness in my chest that felt like it might never fill. I earned a full scholarship to the New England Conservatory in Boston when I was 18, a merit-based award that covered tuition completely based on my audition performance of Prokofiev's Piano Concerto No. 3, and I remember calling home with the news, breathless with excitement, because this felt like validation, like proof that all those hours of practice and all those shifts at the restaurant had meant something. My mother's response was measured, careful, tinged with something that sounded like disappointment when she said, "That's wonderful, honey, but it's not really a traditional university, is it?" And my father had added that he hoped I'd consider double majoring in something practical, maybe business or education, something that could lead to stable employment if the music thing didn't work out. David had gotten into Ohio State that same year, a good school but nothing extraordinary, and they threw him a graduation party with 50 guests and a sheet cake decorated with "Congratulations, future business leader" in scarlet and gray frosting. And when I graduated high school 2 weeks later, we went to dinner at Applebee's, just the four of us, and nobody mentioned my conservatory scholarship. They paid for David's entire undergraduate education, $23,000 per year for 4 years, plus his housing, his meal plan, his textbooks, and the used Honda Accord they bought him sophomore year, so he wouldn't have to take the bus to his internship. My scholarship covered tuition, but nothing else. So I moved to Boston with $1,400 in savings from the restaurant and found 3 jobs within the first month. Morning shifts at a coffee shop near campus, afternoon teaching beginner piano lessons to children in Brookline at $25 per hour, and weekend evening work serving at a hotel restaurant in downtown Boston. I worked 40 hours per week on top of my full course load, practicing piano at midnight in the conservatory's practice rooms when they were finally empty, surviving on employee meal discounts and the cheapest groceries I could find. And I never asked my parents for money because I understood by then that I was on my own, that my path was something I'd have to fund through my own determination. The Steinway stayed in Columbus because moving a grand piano across state lines cost $2,000, money I absolutely did not have. And when I asked my parents if they could keep it safe until I was established enough to have it shipped, my mother said, "Of course, honey, it's not in the way." And I believed her, believed that this one connection to my grandmother and to my childhood would be protected. David went on to Wharton for his MBA 2 years after I started at conservatory, and my parents paid his $70,000 per year tuition without hesitation, covering his rent in Philadelphia, his expenses, everything. And I remember my mother mentioning it casually during one of our brief phone calls, saying, "It's such an investment in his future," while I was literally choosing between buying winter boots and paying my electricity bill. I graduated from conservatory at 22 with honors, having performed as a soloist 3 times with the conservatory orchestra. And my parents didn't attend the graduation ceremony because it was in May, and they'd already planned a vacation to Myrtle Beach that week, a trip they didn't invite me to. I got my first professional position 6 months later, a pianist role with a regional orchestra in upstate New York paying $38,000 per year. And when I called to tell them I'd gotten my first real job as a professional musician, my mother said, "That's nice, dear, very nice." And then immediately pivoted to tell me that David had just made junior partner at his consulting firm, her voice swelling with pride in a way it never had for me. And I sat in my studio apartment that smelled like the Chinese restaurant downstairs and understood that nothing I achieved would ever be enough, that I'd chosen a path they would never respect no matter how far it took me. I'm 32 now, and by any objective measure, I've built a career that should command respect. Yet my parents still introduce me at social gatherings as our daughter who plays piano, in the same tone someone might use to say, "Our daughter who does yoga," or "Our daughter who collects stamps," like it's a pleasant hobby I indulge in on weekends rather than the professional achievement that defines my entire adult life. I'm the principal pianist with the New York Philharmonic, a position I earned at age 29 after 6 years of working my way up through smaller orchestras. And I make $240,000 per year in base salary, plus performance fees that typically add another $80,000 to $100,000 annually, depending on my touring schedule and recording work. I've released 3 albums on a major classical label, each one receiving critical acclaim in publications like Gramophone and BBC Music Magazine. And I've performed as a soloist with orchestras in London, Vienna, Tokyo, and Sydney, playing in concert halls I used to dream about as a teenager practicing in my childhood home. Last year, I performed Gershwin's Rhapsody in Blue at Carnegie Hall with a sold-out audience of 2,804 people, and the New York Times Review called my interpretation luminous and technically flawless, a reminder that virtuosity and emotional depth need not be mutually exclusive. And I sent the clipping to my parents thinking maybe this time they'd understand what I'd achieved. My mother's response came 3 days later, a text message that said, "That's wonderful, honey," followed immediately by, "David just bought a new Audi Q7. We went with him to the dealership. It has heated seats and a backup camera." David is my older brother, 34 years old, a real estate developer in Columbus who's moderately successful by conventional standards, married to Jennifer with 2 kids ages 6 and 8. Living in a 4-bedroom colonial in a suburb with good schools and a homeowners association that regulates fence heights. My parents talk about him with a pride that borders on reverence, describing his work as building communities and creating value. And they know the square footage of every property he's developed, the profit margins on his deals, the clients he's courted, while they couldn't name a single piece I've performed or tell you the difference between Rachmaninoff and Ravel. At family dinners, which happen 3 or 4 times a year when I can make the trip from New York to Ohio, they ask David detailed questions about his projects, his financing, his partnerships, leaning forward with genuine interest. And when they turn to me, it's always, "Still playing piano?" or "Any concerts coming up?" in a tone that expects a simple yes or no. And if I try to elaborate about a particularly challenging piece I'm learning or an upcoming international tour, I can see their attention drifting, their eyes glazing over with polite disinterest, until my mother finds an excuse to redirect the conversation back to David's latest acquisition or his children's soccer schedules. 2 months ago, we gathered for Sunday dinner at their house, the same house I grew up in with its beige carpets and family photos covering the hallway walls. And I'd just returned from a 3-week European tour that included performances in Berlin, Prague, and Amsterdam, 17 concerts across 3 countries. And I was trying to tell them about performing at the Concertgebouw, one of the most acoustically perfect halls in the world, a venue where legendary pianists have played for over a century, and my mother interrupted me mid-sentence to show everyone photos on her phone of David's new SUV, a silver luxury vehicle with third-row seating and a panoramic sunroof, and everyone crowded around her phone saying beautiful and so practical, while I sat there with my unfinished story dissolving into silence, understanding once again that nothing I accomplished would ever be as worthy of their attention as David's material acquisitions. I called my mother that evening after staring at her text message for 20 minutes, trying to compose myself enough to speak without my voice breaking, and when she answered, I could hear the television in the background playing one of those home renovation shows she loves, the sound of casual comfort while my world was crumbling. "Mom, about the piano," I started, keeping my tone as level as possible. "I need to understand what happened." She sighed like I was being inconvenient, like I was interrupting something important, and said, "Emma, honey, it was just sitting there in the living room taking up space, and we needed the room for when David's kids visit. You know how they like to spread out their toys. And this man responded to my Facebook Marketplace ad and came to look at it and said $500 was a fair price, so we took it." I felt something crack inside my chest, something that had been holding together for years finally splintering. "Mom, that wasn't just any piano. That was a 1923 Steinway Model M grand piano. Do you understand what that means? Those are worth tens of thousands of dollars, maybe 40 or 50,000 in the condition it was in." She actually laughed, a dismissive little sound that felt like a slap. "Oh, Emma, don't be so dramatic. The man who bought it seemed very knowledgeable, and he said 500 was fair for such an old instrument. You always exaggerate about these music things." I closed my eyes, gripping my phone so hard my knuckles went white. "Who was he? Who did you sell it to? Do you have his contact information?" My mother's tone shifted to defensive. "I don't know, some man from the internet. He had a truck and 2 helpers. They loaded it up on Saturday and that was that. Why does it matter? It's done now." I couldn't speak for a moment. Couldn't force words past the tightness in my throat. "Mom, that piano was Grandma's. She left it to me specifically in her will. Do you remember that? 20 years ago when she died, she left it to me because she knew how much I loved it, how much it meant to me." There was a pause, and when my mother spoke again, her voice carried that familiar impatience she always used when she thought I was being overly sensitive. "Well, you left it here. You've been in New York for years and never came to get it. We thought you didn't want it anymore. We needed the space." The television noise continued in the background, cheerful and oblivious, and I realized that to her, this was just a minor household decision, getting rid of an old piece of furniture, no different than selling a couch or a bookshelf. The piano that represented every hour of practice, every dream I'd chased, every memory of my grandmother sitting beside me on that bench, showing me how to shape a phrase or find the emotion in a difficult passage. To my mother, it was just something taking up space in her living room, an inconvenience finally removed, and she genuinely could not understand why I was upset. I spent the next 3 days trying to trace the piano, reaching out to every piano dealer and restoration specialist within a 100-mile radius of my parents' home in Ohio, posting in online musician forums with detailed descriptions of the instrument, including its serial number, which I'd memorized years ago, checking Facebook Marketplace and Craigslist and every resale platform I could find, hoping against hope that maybe I could track it down and somehow buy it back regardless of cost. A piano restorer in Cleveland named Michael finally called me back after seeing my forum post, and his voice was gentle when he told me he'd heard about a 1923 Steinway Model M that had recently come through an estate liquidator's hands, sold privately to a collector in Pennsylvania for $47,000. And the timeline matched exactly with when my parents had let it go. $47,000. The number sat in my stomach like a stone. Michael explained that instruments from that era in good condition were increasingly rare, that the buyer had absolutely known what he was getting when he showed up at my parents' house with his casual offer of $500. that this was a person who made his living finding naive sellers and taking advantage of their ignorance. And while it wasn't technically illegal, it was certainly predatory, especially when the instrument had such obvious value to anyone with even basic knowledge of pianos. I thanked Michael and sat in my Manhattan apartment, staring at the empty corner where I'd always planned to eventually put that piano once I had space, once I could afford the moving costs, once my life felt settled enough to bring my grandmother's instrument home where it belonged. The money didn't matter to me, not really. I could have bought a comparable instrument if I wanted, could have spent 50,000 or more on a piano without significantly impacting my financial situation. But this particular piano was irreplaceable, every scratch on its surface familiar, every quirk of its action memorized by my fingers over 27 years of playing. I'd learned Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat major on that piano when I was 12, had worked through Beethoven's Pathetique Sonata at 15, had played Rachmaninoff's Prelude in C-sharp minor over and over at 17 when I was preparing my conservatory auditions, and my grandmother had sat beside me for so many of those hours, her hand occasionally covering mine to show me how to shape a phrase or her voice soft beside my ear, explaining how to find the emotion buried in difficult passages. I called my parents again that evening, needing them to understand what they'd lost, what they'd given away, and my father answered with his usual distracted tone, the television loud in the background. "Dad, I found out what the piano was worth," I said, keeping my voice steady. "A dealer confirmed it sold for $47,000. The man who bought it from you for 500 knew exactly what he was doing." There was a pause, and then my father's voice came back flat and defensive. "Well, we couldn't have known that, Emma. We're not piano experts. Anyway, it's done now. Why do you always have to make everything so difficult?" I heard my mother's voice in the background asking what was wrong, and then she was on the phone, her tone already irritated before I'd said anything. "Your father's right. It's done. And honestly, David said we did the right thing clearing out that space. He knows about business, about property value and staging houses. You're being emotional about this," David said. David knew. The words hit me like a physical blow, and suddenly I understood that this hadn't been just my parents' thoughtless decision. My brother had encouraged it, had validated their choice to dispose of the most precious thing I owned, like it was worthless clutter. And none of them had thought to call me first, to ask if I wanted it moved, to give me any say in what happened to my own inheritance. I texted David the next morning, asking if he could meet me for coffee that weekend, and despite everything, I still hoped that maybe my brother would understand, that maybe he'd see how much this hurt and offer some kind of support, or at least acknowledgement of what had been lost. But when we met at a cafe halfway between his home in the Columbus suburbs and our parents' house, his first words after sitting down were, "Mom said you're upset about the piano," spoken in that tone people use when they think you're being unreasonable about something trivial. I tried to explain calmly, laying out the facts about the instrument's value and what it meant to me, how it was the only tangible connection I had left to our grandmother, how every significant piece I'd ever learned had been practiced on those keys. But David leaned back in his chair with his arms crossed and said, "Emma, you're overreacting. It's just a piano. You're successful now. You perform at Carnegie Hall. You've got money. Just buy your own Steinway if it matters so much." The dismissiveness in his voice was so familiar, so much like our parents, and I felt something shift inside me as I realized he genuinely didn't understand that some things can't be replaced regardless of their monetary value. "It's not about buying a replacement," I said, keeping my voice steady. "It's about the fact that it was mine, left to me by Grandma, and they sold it without even telling me. You have to see how that feels." David shrugged, picking up his coffee. "Mom and Dad needed the space. They're getting older. They want the house to feel more open when my kids visit. Your feelings aren't more important than their comfort in their own home." His words landed like stones, each one deliberate, and I stared at my brother, 40 years old, expensive watch on his wrist, driving a leased BMW he couldn't quite afford, and saw clearly that he'd never once considered my perspective in any family decision. "I heard you told them to sell it," I said quietly. "That you said I was hoarding it there." He had the grace to look slightly uncomfortable but recovered quickly. "I mean, you were. You've been in New York for what, 8 years? 9? You never came to get it, never talked about moving it, just left it sitting in their living room like storage. They're not a warehouse for your stuff." The betrayal cut deeper than my parents' actions because David knew, he'd always known, how much that piano meant to me. He'd sat through enough childhood recitals, had seen me practice for hours every day, had watched our grandmother teach me with such patience and love, and he'd decided that our parents' convenience mattered more than my connection to the only family member who'd ever truly believed in my gifts. I learned something else during that coffee meeting, information that slipped out when David mentioned he was temporarily between properties because some investments hadn't panned out the way he'd projected, and I remembered our Aunt Marie mentioning at Christmas that David had borrowed money from our parents again, and suddenly I understood that my brother, who presented himself as this successful real estate developer with his nice clothes and expensive car, was actually over-leveraged and cash poor, living on credit and parental loans while looking down on my career as if financial success was the only measure of worth. And the irony would have been funny if it hadn't been so painful to realize that our parents had poured money into his failing ventures while never once asking if I needed anything. Never once recognizing that I'd built genuine stability through the career they'd always dismissed as impractical. I found out about my parents' retirement plans 3 days after my coffee meeting with David, and the information came not from them, but from my Aunt Marie during one of our occasional phone calls, where she caught me up on family news that no one else bothered to share with me. "I'm so excited for your parents," she said warmly. "Florida will be wonderful for them. That condo community looks beautiful from the photos your mother showed me. Right near the beach, lovely pool, activities for seniors. They got such a good deal, too, $380,000 for a 2-bedroom unit in that location." I'd gone very still on my end of the phone, processing this information that apparently everyone in the family knew except me. Marie continued talking about how they were selling the Ohio house, how they'd already accepted an offer of $420,000, which would give them plenty of money after paying off their small remaining mortgage, how David had been helping them search for properties and negotiate with developers, and I felt that familiar sensation of being on the outside of my own family, learning about major life changes through secondhand conversations, while my brother was intimately involved in every decision. After I got off the phone, I did the math almost automatically, the numbers arranging themselves in my mind with cold clarity. $420,000 from the house sale, minus their remaining mortgage of roughly $30,000, left them with $390,000 in liquid cash, and they were spending $380,000 on the Florida condo. And suddenly, the timeline of the piano sale made perfect sense in the most painful way possible. They hadn't sold my grandmother's Steinway because they desperately needed $500. They'd sold it as a casual afterthought while planning a major financial transaction, treating my most precious possession like spare change. They might as well collect while clearing space. And the fact that they'd put down a $10,000 deposit on their retirement condo and never once mentioned any of these plans to me felt like another confirmation of how little I factored into their lives. I looked up the property online that evening, finding the development easily through a quick search of luxury retirement communities in the area Marie had mentioned, and the website showed pristine photos of a modern building with palm trees and sunset views, describing 12 exclusive units in a boutique community designed for active seniors. And I sat staring at the virtual tour, thinking about how they'd planned this entire next chapter of their lives without a single conversation with me while involving David in every detail. The closing date listed on the deposit paperwork I later learned about was 90 days from when they'd made their offer. which meant they'd already been deep in this process when they'd casually disposed of my piano for what amounted to furniture money in the context of a $380,000 purchase. And I understood then that the instrument hadn't even registered as significant in their minds, just another item to liquidate while preparing for their move. Another piece of my life they could discard without a second thought because it related to music rather than something they considered substantial like real estate or business. What my parents never understood, what they never bothered to ask about or investigate beyond their casual dismissals, was that I'd built something genuinely substantial from the career they'd always treated as a frivolous hobby, and the numbers told a story they'd never imagined possible because they'd stopped paying attention to my life years ago when it became clear I wouldn't follow the conventional path they valued. My base salary as principal pianist with the New York Philharmonic was $240,000 annually, but that represented only a fraction of my actual income because it didn't account for the performance fees I earned from solo concerts that ranged from $15,000 to $40,000 per engagement depending on the venue and program, or the recording royalties from my 3 critically acclaimed albums that had sold surprisingly well in the classical music market, or the teaching fees from the master classes I gave at prestigious conservatories throughout the year. Over 14 years of careful financial management, living below my means even as my income grew, investing wisely with the help of a financial advisor I'd hired when I signed my first major recording contract, I'd accumulated $1.2 million in savings and investment accounts, and I owned my Manhattan apartment outright after paying off the mortgage 2 years early. A one-bedroom in a beautiful pre-war building near Lincoln Center that I'd purchased for $650,000 8 years ago, and that was now worth approximately $800,000, according to recent comparable sales in my building. Just 3 months before the piano incident, I'd signed a new recording contract with Deutsche Grammophon, one of the most prestigious classical labels in the world, a 3-year deal worth $500,000 that would produce 2 albums of repertoire I'd been wanting to record for years, and the signing had been covered in major music publications and even mentioned in the New York Times arts section, though my parents never saw these articles because they didn't follow my career with enough interest to search for my name or read the links I occasionally sent them. I'd performed for 3 different heads of state over the past 5 years, had been featured on NPR's Tiny Desk concert series, where the video had gotten over 2 million views, had won the Avery Fisher Career Grant, which came with $25,000, and was considered one of the most prestigious awards in classical music, and had been profiled in The New Yorker in a piece about young artists keeping classical music vital and relevant. But when my parents introduced me at family gatherings or to their friends, they said, "This is our daughter Emma, she plays piano." In the same tone someone might say she does data entry, while they introduced David as our son, the real estate developer, with obvious pride despite the fact that his business was struggling and his net worth was less than a third of mine. The contrast between their perception and reality had always hurt. But it reached a particularly painful point 4 months ago when I'd sent them tickets to my performance at Lincoln Center's Alice Tully Hall, where I was playing Rachmaninoff's Third Piano Concerto with a full orchestra, one of the most technically demanding pieces in the piano repertoire, and a career milestone I'd worked toward for years, and they'd declined to attend because David's 7-year-old son had a school play that same week, not even the same day, but the same week, as if a 2-hour drive to see their daughter perform at one of the world's most prestigious venues was somehow impossible to schedule around an elementary school production that happened on a completely different evening. The opportunity presented itself in the most unexpected way, through a connection I'd never imagined would intersect with my family's affairs. When I received an email 2 days after my conversation with Aunt Marie from Marcus Chen, a real estate investor who'd been attending my performances for 3 years and had become something of a friend in that peculiar way that develops between artists and devoted patrons who share occasional conversations after concerts. Marcus wrote that he'd heard through mutual acquaintances that I had family relocating to Florida and wondered if I needed any advice about the area, since he had investments throughout the state. And on impulse, I mentioned the development my parents were buying into, not expecting anything particular from the conversation, but finding some comfort in discussing the situation with someone outside the family dynamic. His response came within an hour and contained information that made my heart beat faster as I read it. He knew the development well because the developer, Richard Paulson, was actually a client of his firm for financing consultation, and he was familiar with the particular challenges Paulson was facing with this project. The building had 12 units total, and Paulson had sold 10 of them, but he needed to close all 12 sales within the next 45 days to satisfy the terms of his construction financing or face significant penalty fees from his lenders, and Marcus happened to know that Paulson was increasingly anxious about the timeline because 2 units remained unsold, and my parents' closing was still 60 days out, too late for his financing deadline. Marcus mentioned casually that Paulson would likely accept an offer from an investor willing to purchase the remaining units at a slight discount if it meant closing quickly with a cash buyer, maybe 15% below his listed prices. And as I read those words, I felt something click into place in my mind with a clarity that was almost physical. I could buy those units, both of them, including the one my parents had deposited on, and the thought arrived fully formed with all its implications trailing behind it like a comet's tail. They would lose their dream retirement condo to an anonymous investor. They would scramble to find alternatives. They would feel the helplessness and dismissal that came from having something precious taken away casually by people who didn't understand its value. And then I could reveal myself and offer them exactly what they'd lost, but on terms that finally made them see me as I actually was, rather than as they'd always imagined me. The idea felt like justice, but it also felt dangerous, teetering on some edge between rightful correction and cruel revenge. And I sat with my laptop open, staring at Marcus's email for nearly an hour, trying to understand my own motivations and whether this impulse came from a healthy place or from the wounded child inside me, who'd never stopped trying to make her parents look up from David's tennis matches long enough to notice her playing Rachmaninoff in the corner. I spent the next 7 days in a state of suspended decision, not quite moving forward, but unable to let the idea go. And the weight of the choice sat with me through rehearsals and practice sessions and sleepless nights where I lay in my apartment, listening to the ambient sounds of Manhattan traffic and asking myself questions I couldn't quite answer about justice and revenge and where the line between them fell. I called Dr. Patricia Hendricks, my therapist of 4 years, who'd helped me navigate so much of the family dynamics that had shaped my adult relationships and my persistent struggle with self-worth despite external success. And in her calm office overlooking Central Park, I laid out the entire situation, from the piano's sale to Marcus's email to the opportunity that now sat before me, like a chess move I couldn't quite evaluate. She listened without judgment as I worked through my own reasoning, asking questions that forced me to examine my motivations with uncomfortable honesty. Did I want to hurt them or help them see me? Did I want revenge or recognition? Was this about the piano or about 32 years of accumulated dismissals that had left me successful and financially secure, but still somehow seeking approval from people who'd proven incapable of offering it? We talked about the patterns she and I had discussed so many times before, the way I'd spent my entire childhood and young adulthood trying to make my parents look up from David's achievements long enough to notice mine, the recitals I'd invited them to with hope that diminished each time, but never quite disappeared, the awards and articles and accomplishments I'd mentioned casually hoping they'd ask questions that never came. The piano wasn't just an instrument, Dr. Hendricks helped me articulate. It was the last physical connection to the one person in my family who'd seen me clearly, my grandmother who'd left it to me specifically in her will 20 years ago, with a note that said, "For Emma, who has the gift and the dedication to honor it," and my parents' casual disposal of it for $500 and space for David's children's toys represented something larger than carelessness or ignorance. I remembered sitting at that piano at age 6 playing my first complete piece while my grandmother sat beside me with tears in her eyes. Remembered her hands guiding mine through difficult passages. Remembered the way she'd attended every single recital, even after she got sick and needed a wheelchair. Remembered her telling me 2 weeks before she died that I had something rare and precious and I should never let anyone convince me otherwise. My parents had promised to keep it safe when I couldn't afford to move it to my first apartment, had assured me it would be waiting whenever I was ready to transport it properly, and they'd broken that promise not out of necessity, but out of casual disregard for something they'd never valued, because they'd never valued the part of me it represented. Dr. Hendricks asked me what I hoped would happen if I bought those condos. What outcome would make this feel like the right choice? And I realized after a long silence that I didn't want them to suffer or scramble or feel the kind of pain I'd felt when I learned about the piano. What I wanted, what I'd perhaps always wanted, was for them to finally see me as I actually was, rather than as they'd decided I must be, to recognize that their dismissed daughter had built something substantial and valuable, to understand that their measure of success had been too narrow to capture what I'd achieved. I didn't want revenge, I wanted recognition. I wanted them to see. I made my decision on a Thursday morning, and by Friday afternoon, I was sitting in the office of Jennifer Walsh, the real estate attorney who'd handled my apartment purchase 3 years earlier, and who I trusted to navigate this transaction with both competence and discretion. Jennifer listened as I explained what I wanted to do, her expression never shifting from professional neutrality even as I detailed the family dynamics that had led me to this point. And when I finished, she was quiet for a moment before saying that legally, there was nothing problematic about the purchase, but she wanted to make sure I understood the personal implications of what I was setting in motion. I told her I'd spent a week wrestling with exactly those implications and had come to the conclusion that this was something I needed to do, not from a place of cruelty, but from a place of finally asserting my own worth in a way my family couldn't ignore or dismiss. Jennifer nodded and said she'd reach out to Richard Paulson, the developer, through proper channels to make an initial inquiry about purchasing the remaining units, and I asked her to structure the purchase through a limited liability company rather than in my personal name because I wanted to control the timing of when my parents discovered my involvement. Within 2 days, Jennifer called to say that Paulson was extremely interested in the proposal, and that Marcus Chen had been right about the developer's timeline pressures. Paulson's construction financing required him to close all 12 units within 45 days, or face penalty fees that would amount to nearly $60,000. And my parents' closing date was scheduled for 90 days out, which meant their deposit and purchase agreement didn't solve his immediate problem. Jennifer had proposed that I purchase both remaining units for $735,000 in cash, with a closing in 30 days, which represented roughly a 15% discount from Paulson's listed prices of $380,000 per unit, but gave him the certainty and speed he desperately needed. Paulson accepted the offer within 6 hours. The next 3 weeks passed in a blur of paperwork and wire transfers and title searches, all handled efficiently by Jennifer, while I maintained my regular schedule of rehearsals and performances and tried not to think too much about what I was setting in motion. I established an LLC called Meadowbrook Properties with myself as the sole member and manager, a generic name that revealed nothing about my identity or intentions, and I moved $750,000 from my savings account to cover the purchase price and closing costs. The closing took place on a Tuesday morning in a conference room in Fort Myers with Jennifer present via video conference and me signing documents electronically from my apartment between a morning practice session and an afternoon meeting with my recording label. By 3 o'clock that afternoon, I owned 2 luxury condos in Florida, including Unit 11, the exact property my parents had chosen for their retirement, and placed a $10,000 deposit on. Jennifer confirmed that per the standard purchase contract, Paulson would return my parents' deposit since he was selling the unit to another buyer before their scheduled closing date, and she asked one more time if I was certain I wanted to proceed with keeping my ownership private for now. I told her I was certain because I needed to see how my parents would handle the disappointment, whether they would reach out to me for help or support, or whether I would remain invisible to them even in crisis. Jennifer said she understood and that she'd handle any follow-up documentation. And after we ended the call, I sat in my apartment looking out at the Manhattan skyline and feeling the weight of what I'd done settle over me like a physical presence. This irreversible choice that would reshape my family's understanding of who I was and what I was capable of. And I wondered if they would finally see me, or if even this wouldn't be enough to break through the willful blindness they'd maintained for 32 years. My mother's call came on a Thursday afternoon while I was in a rehearsal break, her voice tight with an emotion I couldn't immediately identify as anger or panic or something else entirely, and before I could even say hello properly, she launched into a breathless explanation that their Florida condo had fallen through, that the developer had called that morning to inform them that Unit 11 had been sold to another buyer who'd closed faster, and that their $10,000 deposit was being returned. But the condo they'd chosen and planned for and already told all their friends about was gone. I felt my stomach clench with a complicated mixture of guilt and vindication as I listened to her vent, not asking me for anything, but simply needing someone to absorb her distress. And she explained in increasingly agitated detail that they'd already accepted an offer on the Ohio house with a closing date in 60 days, that they'd started packing and sorting and donating furniture, that they'd measured the Florida condo's rooms and planned where everything would go, that they'd researched the best golf courses nearby and identified which grocery stores they'd use, and essentially built an entire imagined life in a space they would now never occupy. My father took the phone from her at some point, and his voice carried a defeated quality I'd rarely heard from him, this man who'd always presented himself as completely in control and pragmatically unflappable, and he said, "This is a disaster, Emma. We don't know what we'll do. We've been looking at other places in the area, but nothing compares in our budget, and we're running out of time." I made sympathetic sounds and asked careful questions about their timeline and what alternatives they'd found. And what struck me most powerfully was that through this entire conversation, neither of them asked for my help or advice, never once considered that I might have resources or knowledge or connections that could assist them. And my mother mentioned almost casually that David was unfortunately too busy with his own properties to help them search for new places, but that he'd suggested they look at communities farther from the coast where prices were lower. She circled back multiple times to their frustration with the situation, with developers who only cared about money, with investors who swooped in and disrupted ordinary people's retirement plans, and at one point she said with bitter irony, "At least we got that $500 from your piano, so we'll have a little extra for wherever we end up." And I had to close my eyes against the wave of emotion that crashed over me at hearing her reduce my grandmother's Steinway to a minor financial footnote in their current crisis. I let them talk for nearly 40 minutes, offering nothing but listening, and when we finally ended the call, I sat in the empty rehearsal room, staring at my phone, and understanding with absolute clarity that even in crisis, even when facing a problem that I had both caused and could solve, I remained invisible to them as a person capable of offering anything meaningful. My mother's call came 3 days later on a Sunday afternoon, her voice carrying a forced brightness that I recognized as the tone she used when trying to maintain normalcy in situations she found stressful. And she said that she and my father would love to have me come to dinner on Wednesday evening because it's been too long since we had the whole family together. Which was both true and revelatory, since usually their family gatherings were scheduled around David's availability, with my attendance treated as optional. I agreed to come and made the 5-hour drive from Manhattan to their house in suburban Columbus on Wednesday, arriving just before 6 to find David's BMW already parked in the driveway alongside a Honda CR-V I recognized as belonging to his wife Jessica, and when I walked in carrying a bottle of wine, My mother accepted it with distracted thanks before immediately returning to her conversation with my father about square footage and homeowners association fees. The dining room table was covered with printouts from real estate websites and handwritten notes in my mother's precise script. And David stood near the window talking quietly on his phone, while Jessica sat at the table scrolling through listings on her tablet. And the atmosphere in the room was tense in a way that felt both familiar and distinctly uncomfortable. This family that had never quite known how to be comfortable with me, now gathered in crisis. Dinner was the pot roast my mother always made for what she considered important family meetings, served with roasted potatoes and green beans that we ate while my parents explained in exhaustive detail the housing options they'd identified in Florida, none of which seemed to satisfy them the way Unit 11 had. And my father kept returning to the phrase, investment timeline, with increasing frustration, while my mother worried aloud about whether the communities they were now considering would have the same caliber of amenities and neighbors. David contributed periodic suggestions about broadening their search radius or considering slightly older buildings, speaking in the authoritative tone he used when discussing real estate, despite the fact that his expertise was in commercial properties rather than residential retirement communities. And Jessica mostly stayed quiet, except to offer supportive murmurs at appropriate moments. I ate my pot roast and listened and watched the dynamics play out exactly as they always had, with David positioned as the expert whose opinion mattered, and me present but peripheral. And at one point, my mother said with a sigh, "At least we got that $500 from your piano, Emma, so we'll have a little extra for furniture wherever we end up." And I felt something crystallize inside me at hearing her reduce my grandmother's Steinway to a minor financial convenience for perhaps the third or fourth time. Jessica, who had always been kind to me in the careful way people are kind to their spouse's less favored sibling, looked up from her tablet and said, "Emma, didn't you just get back from that European tour? How was Prague?" And I started to answer, describing the Rudolfinum concert hall and the standing ovation and the reception afterward with the Czech culture minister. But before I'd spoken for more than 30 seconds, my mother interrupted to ask David whether he thought beige or gray would be better for hypothetical living room walls. And I stopped mid-sentence and watched as the conversation flowed around me as though I'd never spoken. That was the moment I decided it was time to tell them, not from anger, but from a calm certainty that nothing would change unless I forced the change myself. I set down my fork and took a slow breath, feeling the moment crystallize around me with perfect clarity, and then I said in a voice that came out calmer than I'd expected, "Actually, I might be able to help with your housing situation." The conversation at the table stopped mid-sentence, and four faces turned toward me with varying expressions of surprise, my parents looking almost confused as though they couldn't quite process why I would think I had anything to offer regarding something as serious and complex as real estate, and my mother recovered first and said with the kind of patient tone you'd use with a child who doesn't understand adult matters, "That's sweet, Emma, but this is really a complicated situation, and we need to find something quickly." I nodded and continued as though she hadn't spoken. "I know you're disappointed about losing that Florida condo, and I understand how frustrating it must be to have your plans disrupted like that." My father made a sound of agreement, and my mother sighed deeply and said, "Yes, some investor swooped in with cash, and the developer just sold it right out from under us, and that's what happens these days. Developers only care about money, and they don't think about people who are trying to plan their retirement." And there was real bitterness in her voice that I recognized as the same tone she used whenever she felt the world had treated her unfairly. I let her words hang in the air for a moment and then said carefully, watching their faces, "That investor paid $735,000 for 2 units, actually. It was a good investment because those units were significantly underpriced for the current market in that area." David had been leaning against the doorframe, half listening, but now he straightened and looked at me with narrowed eyes and asked, "How do you know the specific details of the transaction? Did you look up public records or something?" And I could hear the skepticism in his voice. the assumption that I'd done some amateur internet research and was now pretending to knowledge I didn't really possess. I met his gaze steadily and said, I know the details because I'm the investor who bought them. I purchased both remaining units in that building, including Unit 11, the one you put your deposit on. The silence that followed was so complete I could hear the kitchen clock ticking in the next room and see my mother's face go through a series of expressions from confusion to comprehension to something that looked almost like betrayal. And my father set down his water glass with a hand that trembled slightly and said, What? In a tone that suggested he thought he must have misheard me. Jessica's eyes went wide, and she looked between me and David with an expression of dawning realization, and David himself pushed off from the doorframe and took 2 steps toward the table and said with his voice rising, You did what? The silence that followed my revelation lasted perhaps 3 seconds, but felt like minutes as I watched comprehension dawn on 4 faces simultaneously, and then my mother's voice came out high and strained as she said, What? Why would you do that? That's our retirement. And I could hear genuine shock in her tone, mixed with something that sounded like betrayal, as though I'd committed some unthinkable act of sabotage rather than made a legitimate business transaction. My father set his napkin on the table with deliberate precision and said in the carefully controlled voice he used when he was actually furious, This is vindictive, Emma. This is you punishing us over a piano. And I saw David push away from the wall and take another step toward the table with his face flushed red and his eyes flashing with anger as he said loudly, You can't be serious. You sabotaged our parents. You knew they wanted that unit, and you deliberately bought it out from under them. Jessica put a hand on David's arm, but he shook it off, and I remained seated with my hands folded in my lap and said in a voice that came out calmer than I felt, I didn't sabotage anything. I made a sound real estate investment. The developer offered a discount for buying multiple units, and I took advantage of that opportunity. Those 2 units are worth approximately $850,000 in the current market based on comparable properties in that area, which means I bought them for about 15% below market value. David's hands clenched into fists at his sides, and he said, That's bullshit, and you know it. You're being petty. And I felt something shift inside me as I looked at my brother and said quietly, Am I? Am I being petty? You're the one who told them to sell my grandmother's $47,000 Steinway piano for $500 because you thought I was hoarding it at their house. My mother's face went pale and she said, What do you mean $47,000? The man who bought it said it was only worth $500. He said old pianos aren't valuable unless they're in perfect condition. And I turned to look at her directly and said, The man lied. He knew exactly what he was buying. That was a 1923 Steinway Model M grand piano in excellent playing condition with only minor cosmetic wear. I had it appraised 6 years ago when I was considering moving it. The appraiser valued it at $45,000 then, and vintage Steinways have only appreciated since. My father made a dismissive gesture with his hand and said, Well, how are we supposed to know that? You never told us it was valuable. And I felt the words catch in my throat as I said, I told you it was Grandma's Steinway. I told you she left it specifically to me in her will. I told you it was irreplaceable. You didn't ask about the monetary value because you didn't care. I felt something inside me that had been carefully contained for years begin to surface, and I continued speaking with a quiet intensity that surprised even me as I said, That piano was the only thing I had from Grandma, the only physical connection to the one person in this family who believed I had talent worth nurturing, and she left it to me specifically in her will 20 years ago, because she knew what it meant to me, and you stored it at your house because when I was 22 and just starting out, I couldn't afford to move a grand piano into my tiny apartment, and you promised me you'd keep it safe. The words were coming faster now as years of accumulated hurt found their voice. And I said, You never attended my concerts, not the ones in high school when I won regional competitions, not the one at my conservatory graduation when I performed the Rachmaninoff Third, that I'd spent 2 years perfecting, not the ones when I joined the Philharmonic, Not even the one at Carnegie Hall 3 months ago when I sent you tickets and you said you couldn't come because David's son had a school play that week. Not the same day, the same week. My mother opened her mouth to interrupt and said, "You're being dramatic. We've supported you." But I held up my hand and said, "No, I'm being clear. Perhaps for the first time in my life, I'm being completely clear about what this family has been like for me." I looked at each of them in turn and continued. "You dismissed my career at every opportunity. You refused to pay for Juilliard prep classes when I was 15 and told me music wouldn't lead to a real career. You made me get a part-time job to pay for my own lessons while you paid for David's tennis coaching and SAT prep and college consultants. You funded his entire MBA at Wharton while I worked 3 jobs to cover my living expenses on a full scholarship. And when I got my first orchestra position, your response was to tell me about David making junior partner." My father's face had gone red and he said, "So this is revenge then? This is you punishing us for not being perfect parents?" And I felt the truth of what I needed to say settle into my chest as I replied, "No, this isn't revenge. This is a property investment that happens to come with a lesson. And the lesson is this. You have spent 32 years treating me like my choices were foolish and my achievements were insignificant. You've never valued what I do or who I am. And the piano being sold for $500 like it was garage sale furniture was simply the final proof that you will never see me the way I needed you to see me." I took a breath and felt the clarity that comes when you finally stop running from truth and said in a voice that had steadied into something resembling calm, "Here's what I'm offering. You can live in that condo, the exact one you wanted, Unit 11. My parents looked confused, and my mother glanced at my father with an expression that suggested she thought I was being cruel, that I'd made my point and was now twisting the knife. And my father said cautiously, "What do you mean we can live in it?" And I replied, "I mean exactly that. I'll rent it to you at $1,200 per month." The confusion on their faces deepened, and my father said slowly, That's below market rate." And I could see him doing calculations in his head, because despite everything he'd always been good with numbers, and I nodded and said, "Yes, it's approximately 60% of market rate for that area. Comparable units in that community rent for between $1,900 and $2,200 per month. $1,200 is what I can offer as your daughter." My mother's voice came out uncertain as she asked, "But why would you buy it if you were just going to let us have it? I don't understand what you're trying to accomplish here." And I looked at her directly and said, "Because you needed to understand that I'm not the failure you've always treated me as. I earn $240,000 a year in base salary from the Philharmonic. I have over $1.2 million in savings accumulated from years of careful financial management and performance fees from concerts around the world. I own my Manhattan apartment outright. It's worth $800,000, and it's been paid off for 3 years. I just signed a recording contract worth $500,000 over 3 years with Deutsche Grammophon, one of the most prestigious classical labels in the world. I can buy properties in cash while touring internationally and performing for presidents and prime ministers and heads of state." I watched their faces as this information landed and saw something I'd never quite seen before. A dawning comprehension that maybe they'd fundamentally misunderstood something essential about my life. And I continued, "I bought those condos because it was a sound investment, and because I have the financial resources to make a $735,000 cash purchase and barely notice the impact on my portfolio. And I'm offering you below market rent because despite everything, you're still my parents, and I don't actually want you to suffer." My voice carried no triumph, only a kind of exhausted honesty as I said, "But you needed to see me, really see me, and apparently the only language you understand is money and real estate and tangible proof of success in terms you recognize. So here it is." I felt my voice crack slightly, but I kept it strong as I said, "You never asked about my life, not really. You never wanted to know the details of what I do, or how I've built my career, or what my days actually look like." And I saw my mother's hand move to her throat in a gesture I recognized from childhood as discomfort. But I continued, because this truth needed to be spoken completely. You assumed because I chose art over business that I was foolish and impractical. You've spent decades introducing me as our daughter who plays piano, like it's a quirky hobby, while you introduce David as our son, the real estate developer, even though my net worth is triple his, and my income is nearly double what he makes in a good year. I watched David's face go red, and his wife reached for his hand under the table. But I wasn't being cruel. I was simply stating facts that had been deliberately ignored for my entire adult life. And I turned to David directly and said, "You've borrowed $40,000 from Mom and Dad in the past 5 years. I know because Aunt Marie mentioned it last Christmas when she'd had too much wine and thought I knew about it, and I've never asked them for a single dollar since I was 18 years old." My parents looked deeply uncomfortable because this was true, and they'd never considered the disparity, had never thought about how their successful businessman's son was constantly needing financial help, while their artist daughter had been completely self-sufficient since leaving home. And my father shifted in his seat and said quietly, "We didn't think you needed help. You always seemed fine." And I felt something like sad laughter try to rise in my throat as I replied, "I didn't need help because I made sure I never would, because I knew, from the time I was 15 years old, that I was on my own, that if I wanted to pursue music, I'd have to fund it myself and prove myself constantly, and never give you reason to say I told you so about my choices." I looked at each of them and felt the weight of 32 years settling into this moment as I said, "I'm not angry anymore. I've spent too many years being angry and hurt and trying to make you see me. But I'm done now. I'm done seeking approval I'll never receive and trying to translate my accomplishments into language you'll value." The room was completely silent, and I delivered the final truth as I said, "You can accept my offer and rent the condo for $1,200 a month, or you can find another place, but either way, this is the last time I'll try to prove my worth to you. And you have 24 hours to decide what you want to do." I stood up from the table feeling lighter than I had in years, picked up my purse, and walked toward the door as my mother called after me, "Emma, wait. We need to talk about this." But I turned and said calmly, "No, you need to think about this, and then you need to decide. I'll be at my hotel." And I left my childhood home, knowing that whatever they chose, I'd finally spoken the truth that had lived in my chest for decades. 3 weeks later, my parents accepted my offer because they had no better options given their timeline and their budget, and the fact that the Ohio house sale was already in contract with a closing date they couldn't change. And I received a brief email from my father that said simply, "We accept your terms. Thank you for your generosity," which made me feel a complicated mixture of relief and sadness, because even now they couldn't quite manage a real conversation about what had happened. They moved into the Florida condo on a humid Tuesday in May, and I didn't attend the move, instead sending a large arrangement of tropical flowers to be delivered on their first day there with a card that said, "Wishing you happiness in your new home." Because I meant it despite everything. I genuinely didn't want them to be miserable, even though they'd caused me so much pain over the years. David didn't speak to me for a month after that dinner, and then finally sent a short email that said, "You made your point. I guess I never thought about things from your perspective." Which wasn't quite an apology, but was more acknowledgement than I'd ever received from him before, and his wife called me separately to say she was proud of me for standing up for myself, which surprised me because I'd always assumed she sided completely with David on family matters. 6 months passed, and I threw myself into my work with a kind of freedom I hadn't felt before, because I was no longer performing with that small, hopeful voice in the back of my mind, wondering if this would be the accomplishment that finally made my parents see me. And I played better than I ever had, because I was playing purely for the music itself, and for the audiences who actually wanted to hear it. I had a performance scheduled in Miami at the Adrienne Arsht Center as part of a Southeast regional tour, and I looked at the calendar and realized it was just 1 hour from where my parents now lived, and I felt my therapist's voice in my head reminding me that I got to choose what kind of relationship I wanted with them going forward, that I'd set a boundary and now I could decide whether to build a bridge or not. I called my mother and told her about the concert, and there was a long pause before she said, "We'd like to come if you'll send us the details." And her voice sounded smaller than I'd ever heard it, uncertain in a way that made her seem human, rather than like the monolithic figure of judgment she'd been in my mind for so many years. The night of the performance, I was nervous in a way I hadn't been nervous before a concert since my early 20s, because I knew they were in the audience. And when I walked out onto the stage, I scanned the seats until I found them sitting in the orchestra section about 12 rows back. My mother in a blue dress and my father in a suit. And they looked so ordinary and so small in that vast concert hall. I played Rachmaninoff's Second Piano Concerto and Chopin's Ballade No. 1 and a selection of Debussy preludes, and I poured everything into the music, every year of loneliness and determination and triumph and grief. And when the final notes faded and the audience rose in applause, I saw my mother standing with tears streaming down her face. Afterward, they came backstage, and my mother approached me with her hands trembling slightly and said, "I had no idea, Emma. I've heard you play at home, obviously, but watching you up there with the orchestra and seeing how the audience responded and hearing that music, I never understood what you do. I never really understood." And it wasn't quite the apology I'd spent 32 years wanting, but it was something. It was a crack in the wall that had stood between us for my entire life. My father stood beside her, looking uncomfortable but present in a way he rarely was, and he said quietly, "You were extraordinary." And I felt something in my chest loosen slightly, because while these words couldn't erase decades of dismissal, they were at least honest and real in this moment. We went to dinner afterward at a quiet restaurant near the venue, and for the first time in my memory, they asked me questions about my life, real questions about what my days looked like and how I prepared for performances and what it felt like to play with an orchestra. And I answered them honestly, while also recognizing that I no longer needed these questions the way I once had, because I'd finally found validation within myself. Over the following months, we built something tentative and fragile that wasn't the relationship I'd wanted as a child, but was perhaps the only relationship we were capable of having as adults. And I learned to accept that my parents were limited people who'd done the best they could with their own limitations, even though their best had caused me real harm. The story found its true resolution, not in that charged family dinner where I'd revealed my purchase, but rather in the quiet evening 9 months later, when I sat at my new Steinway in my Manhattan apartment, a gorgeous 1967 Model D that I'd purchased from a private collector for $93,000, and which stood gleaming in the space I'd specifically designed to accommodate it. And I played the same Chopin nocturne in E-flat major that my grandmother had taught me when I was 7 years old on that lost 1923 Steinway. As my fingers moved across the keys, I thought about how the rental income from my parents' condo, that $1,200 they paid me each month, went directly toward the mortgage on a property I'd purchased in my grandmother's hometown in Pennsylvania, where I was opening a music school in her name, the Dorothy Chen Academy of Music, which would offer completely free lessons to children whose families couldn't afford traditional music education. I'd hired 3 excellent teachers, and we'd start with 30 students in the fall with plans to expand to 60 within 2 years, and every single one of those children would have access to quality instruments and professional instruction, and the message that their artistic dreams were valid and valuable regardless of what their families thought, or whether music led to what anyone else considered a real career. I'd turned my pain into purpose, and my parents' monthly rent payments now funded the dreams of children exactly like I'd once been. Kids who heard music in their heads and felt it in their bones, and needed just one person to believe in them the way my grandmother had believed in me. Justice, I thought as the final notes of the nocturne faded into the quiet of my apartment, doesn't have to be cruel or vengeful or destructive. Sometimes justice is simply being seen for who you truly are and building something beautiful from the rubble of old wounds. And sometimes it's making sure that the next generation of dreamers has an easier path than you did, because you survived and succeeded, and now have the resources to light the way for others.